Tonight, Vice President Harris was asked if Donald Trump is a fascist.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted. Again, look at their careers. These are not people, with the exception, I think, of only Mike Pence. These were not politicians. These are career people who have served in the highest roles in national security, who have served as generals in our military, who are highly respected. Talking about the person who would be commander-in-chief, not to mention what we know and what they've told us about how he talks about the military, servicemen and women, referring to them as suckers and losers, how he demeans people who have taken an oath to sacrifice their life for our country. And I do believe, Anderson, that part of this is why, even just this week, I traveled this state and others with Liz Cheney, former Congress member who was a very high-ranking Republican. She has endorsed me. Her father, the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, is voting for me. Over 400 previous members of the administration, from Ronald Reagan to both Presidents Bush to Donald Trump even, have endorsed my candidacy. And the reason why, among them, is a legitimate fear based on Donald Trump's words and actions that he will not obey an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. He himself has said he would terminate the Constitution of the United States and wants to earn your vote to stand again behind the seal of the President of the United States? No one standing behind the seal of the President of the United States of America should be in that position saying they want to terminate the Constitution of the United States.
Joining our coverage now is Quentin Fowkes, Principal Deputy Campaign Manager for the Harris-Walz campaign. What do you think the Vice President accomplished in this town hall tonight?
Well, look, Lawrence, what you saw on that stage tonight was a president. I think that the Vice President laid out the stakes of this election. She laid out her positions in this election and how she wants to move this country forward and bring in a new economic opportunity economy so everybody can get ahead. Look, tonight was supposed to be a debate, Lawrence. We shouldn't let that slip. The Vice President has been putting herself out there. She has been going into spaces and places where people don't expect to see Democratic nominees for President of the United States, and Donald Trump has been hiding. He has been only doing interviews with friendly outlets like Fox News. He's been staging photo ops in McDonald's when he is still opposing raising the federal minimum wage. This is who Donald Trump is. But what Americans saw tonight from the Vice President was somebody who is ready to be commander-in-chief, who takes it seriously and will wake up thinking about them every single day, while Donald Trump only thinks about himself.
Yeah, it's a matter of public record that Donald Trump is afraid of debating Kamala Harris again. It's a matter of public record that Donald Trump got destroyed in his debate with Kamala Harris. Let's listen to what the Vice President said tonight about Donald Trump not showing up for tonight's event.
But when companies are taking advantage of the desperation and the need of the American people, we saw it actually during the pandemic as well, where because of supply chain issues, there was a reduction of supply, and then they would inflate the price of everyday necessities. Not to mention, by the way, again, Donald Trump should be here tonight to talk with you and answer your questions. He's not. He refused to come. But understand that part of his plan is to put in place a national sales tax of at least 20% on everyday goods and necessities. And that, by economist estimates, independent economists, would cost you as the American consumer and taxpayer an additional $4,000 a year.
Is that the issue, the primary issue that the Vice President will be focusing on between now and the closing of this campaign?
Well, look, I think it's one of many. Obviously, the economy is top of mind for a lot of voters, and Donald Trump's tax will increase cost on families by $4,000 a year. That is a fact. The vice president is focused on making sure she gets her economic agenda out there. The fact that she wants to make sure that she's expanding Medicare, strengthening Social Security and the Affordable Care Act, but also reproductive freedom and abortion remains one. Donald Trump is still responsible for the fact that 1 in 3 women of reproductive age live under a national abortion ban. And he is going to continue that. And then obviously his plans for the future beyond the economy. Project 2025, this is somebody who is talking about using the military against American citizens, the enemy from within, as he calls it. This is dangerous stuff. And I think you showed a clip earlier, Lawrence, of the vice president talking about why Republicans who have worked for Donald Trump, like 4-star General John Kelly, are saying these things. They are afraid. And that's a sad state in America. I want people at home to really think about this. We have 12 days left in this election, really. Think about this, why these Republicans are saying this about Donald Trump. They've worked for him. They've been in these closed-door meetings with him. They are afraid of how he will use power. And he's saying things like he will have extreme power as president. He will have immunity that a Supreme Court that he largely appointed has given him. This is dangerous stuff, Lawrence, and people should listen to it. And so we're going to continue to point out this danger while also at the same time, as the vice president did tonight, defiantly talking about her vision for the future of this country to clearly lay out the stakes of this election.
Donald Trump cannot name an American general he admires, even from history. This town hall began tonight with Anderson Cooper asking the vice president about Donald Trump's comments praising Hitler. Did you ever expect at the start of this campaign that 79 years after Hitler killed himself, 80 years after Hitler was last a factor in a presidential campaign during World War II, that in the closing weeks we'd be talking about Donald Trump's praise of Adolf Hitler and Adolf Hitler's generals at the end of this campaign?
Lawrence, I wish that the answer to that question was no, but unfortunately, it's not. Donald Trump has been doing this. He's been stoking it. He's been urging people to come out with Nazi flags at his events and at his rallies. He's been stoking this because that is how he leads. He thinks that punching down on the weakest of us in our society and the most vulnerable is strength. He thinks that inciting political violence and using rhetoric like turning the United States military, again, a general that worked for Donald Trump as his chief of staff, said that Donald Trump had to be told multiple times that he cannot use the military on American citizens. This is what we're talking about here. So I wish that the answer to that question was no, but unfortunately it's not. I'm not surprised anymore. And it is our job to continue to make sure that we're getting the message out there that a second Donald Trump term will be extremely dangerous for this country. And all the freedoms and rights that people have will be overturned.
So Donald Trump is confronted with John Kelly's statements where Donald Trump says that he thinks Hitler did some good things. And when Donald Trump issues a written response to John Kelly today, he does not say Hitler did not do good things. Do you think, knowing what you know about the polling and the slices of voting that is out there, that in key battleground states, Donald Trump believes that there are actual American Nazis numbering in the thousands or several hundred, at least, in each battleground state, who could be the margin of victory for him in that state? And that's why he is afraid of condemning Nazism?
I don't think that is what he believes, to be honest with you. I think that his hope is that people will see America as a dark place, as a divisive place, as a place where we have to hate one another in order to get ahead, that we have to demean each other to get ahead, because that's who he is. It's who he's always been, and he continues to show us that at every turn. And so he's hoping that people are going to buy it. But look, I am very confident, because this has been somewhat of a somber interview, but I'm very confident because of the work that this campaign has put in, because of the work that the vice president has been doing to talk about her vision for the future of this country and draw the contrast between herself, where she wants to take this country, and Donald Trump's dark and divisive vision for this country. He's unhinged. He's unstable. But the vice president is hopeful. She sees a bright future for America, one where we can all get ahead, both Republicans and Democrats, one where she can find common sense solutions on both sides of the aisle and bring them to the American people so that they are the ones who are benefiting, because that's what this country is built on. And so while Donald Trump may be banking on his divisive nature to be what breaks through, we're very confident that in 12 days, Americans are going to turn out to vote, as they already are beginning to vote in a lot of the battleground states, and they're going to send Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to the White House.